Hello and welcome back to Embark Studios here in Stockholm, Sweden. In our last video we explored the original concept for Ark Raiders, an epic co-op machine hunting multiplayer game that never quite found its feet. The Ark Raiders that exist today emerged from that idea, but while the team at Embark had a world, a handful of enemy types, and a lot of tools and technology built, from a gameplay perspective they were essentially starting from scratch. Over the next few years they would have to establish how PvP could make the project more interesting, and then craft levels, enemies, and mechanics around that concept. This would prove to be the most challenging time in the project's history. Embark had launched the finals earlier than planned, which had given the Ark Raiders team a bit more runway, but now, years into development, the clock was ticking louder than ever. In this video we're going to cover several fascinating aspects of game design that happened in this period, from how the game looks and sounds, to how the levels were split apart and reassembled, the work that went into wrapping all of this into an extraction shooter form with interesting progression, what happened when they made the decision to drop free to play, and a lot more. But before the team could get to any of that, they'd have to answer one fundamental question. What aspects of the original Pioneer concept would be retained, and what new ideas would come to the table?
A lot of people will leave the planet when it goes south. So we call that the exodus in our lore. And then we have the ecological collapse itself, the depopulation across the globe. And then we start our game much, much later when we are following a generation of people who has no concept of the world that we live in today. So we don't want to carry this sense of loss. We needed to establish that the machines themselves were able to dominate the surface. Naturally, we will be the one underground. If you want something from the top side, you ask a raider.
If we were to have a world realistically depicted in what had happened in this world, there would be nothing left. So we've taken loads of liberties in having things still have a material quality and a sort of nice appeal to it. You try to have this approach of having very naturalistic lighting. And that, for one, brings out a lot of inherent qualities in the things. We don't use a lot of color grading or anything like that because we want to balance everything to have a very naturalistic look. And then we can sort of push the things that need pushing in order to achieve this sort of contrast in between.
First of all, we needed to understand this new category of games. We spent a lot of time playing that. And for me, that was fairly easy. I played a lot of extraction shooter games before. And there's great competitors out there, and there's great games out there. So what can we learn? And we knew from the beginning that the world and its narrative wanted to be. There was something in the market that we felt like there isn't really a game here that speaks to you in that way. So if you're interested in this world and exploring it and learning more about its events and maybe participating yourself in the events of this world, that felt like a pretty clear opportunity for us. Instinctively, a lot of us were just feeling that needed to be there.
The original version of Ark Raiders was based in one massive open world map, but to make a game about looting and finding cover and exploring and listening to threats, the team was going to have to take an entirely new approach to level design. So what areas from Pioneer's world could they reuse, and where would they have to start from scratch? How would the levels in Ark Raiders look and play?
So initially we have this massive world. That was the initial ambition, that every map that we have now would be a server, and then it would be like a battle royale, sending you to the center where the big robot would be, and we would kill the servers as they would go, and so on.
Then after the pivot, obviously two things came up. A game that is about looting, where looting is central. It sort of implies that there is a density in the world. Even if you go into a sort of singular room or an apartment, it needs to hold up for a player's expectations of exploration.
I can't remember the exact number, but we used to have just a wide open world level where all these places existed. And I think today a single one of our maps has more props and actors in it than the whole of that world ever did by a factor of 2 or 3. So we inherited what we call DAM and Spaceport from Pio 1, but they've seen tremendous work put into them, because those were obviously made for a very different game that didn't involve loot or interacting with the environment, or even doors for that matter. It didn't exist back then.
Because we didn't have interiors, all buildings were empty, there was no props, because the game was not a game about the interiors, it was about moving towards the center, so we didn't care if there was a bed in... We still don't have toilets in our game, that's a nice curiosity. We didn't, back in the day, we didn't even have fall damage in the game. So at the first map, there's very horizontal spaceport. You could jump from the towers, shooting and gunning and all of that, right? So I had to change a bunch of those things and put ways for it to go down.
And then spaceport's much wider open in terms of its spacing, so there's a lot of open ground that's exposed, and there's some tunnels and cover to make your way between places, but it becomes a bit more of a risk thing. So you see players kind of moving in rings around places and then finding their ingress and doing what they can, and then trying to get back out again. So it becomes a bit harrowing, especially as the round progresses, where players naturally start collapsing toward the middle, as opposed to Dam, where everyone sort of either swaps sides or stays mixed into the geography around the area. But in terms of gameplay, the Dam we're slating that for kind of our first map players get contact with. It has kind of a lot of easier affordances for a new player. It's got drastic height differences between like kind of the two halves of the map. It's got a good mix of interior and exterior. In the inheritance of Dam and Spaceport in particular, it was tricky over time to morph geometry and things in those levels to work for this type of game, because PvP especially was never a consideration for those. So suddenly things like sightlines and approach angles and dead ends and everything became much more critical to worry about, and making sure the affordance of PvP was correct. And it's even trickier when we have a third-person camera, which affords corner peeking and things like that.
And then Buried City, which is the last one that we've made, is made for this game. It's a more indoors actually map, and a lot of parkour, even though it's not a game about parkour, but there is a lot of ways for you to use the ceilings and the rooftops. It's a more PvP prone map, since it's the one we did with PvP in mind. The other two we adapted for it.
We knew the post-pivot that we needed one contrasting map that would be telling players more clearly that it's set on Earth. Because I think those monolithic structures, if you squint, you go, are we on Mars or are we on? So we wanted to ground the game on Earth, and this game is set in the south of Italy, deeply inspired by that region. And there's a volcano there, and there's a certain biome there, and also to sort of distinguish ourselves from other sort of post-apocalyptic worlds, which is usually sort of America-centric. So we started building out this other world that is Buried City,
where you can spend most of the round in only one or two buildings if you're really trying to, and hearing other players on other floors or building across an alley. And it's kind of an interesting mix between modern structures of like a hospital or a shopping center, and then because our game's based in Italy, it's a lot of old town, like rustic structures, and they're all collapsed and destroyed, and the city itself is half buried in sand. So sometimes you'll walk straight onto a rooftop, go into a building, and then come out on the first floor that is still on a sand dune somewhere, and then worm your way even further through some buildings and end up finally on street level near a park. We had people on the project who were very ingrained in that game loop of I'm running across massive environments and scaling buildings and firing rocket launchers at things, to this much more slow-paced, tactical, thoughtful gameplay. And we shifted kind of very gradually over time, and you'd still get pockets of like, oh, this feels bad, and trying to like shift the mentality from bombastic robot fights to tension-filled rounds to get through. So it was definitely a challenge to build things in a way that helped us transition from one to the other. And there's a lot of legacy stuff even today that we still have to parse through, that is the holdover from what the game was to what it needs to become.
I mentioned it in the opening of this series that I was a massive admirer of many of the team members at Embark, but there's actually one particular team in the studio who I've been dying to interview for years. Several members of the Arc Raiders audio team were previously part of the audio department at DICE, responsible for the award-winning soundscapes of those early Battlefield games, a series that pioneered brutally realistic weapon sounds. The audio design in Arc Raiders is critical to the experience, communicating so much to the players about the threats around them. But before we dive into that, I want to first know why realistic weapon noises have been a hallmark of this team.
It was very different at the time. So I think a lot of people reacted to it just sounding different. And by that time, not even movies had gone that route, really. So it was sort of a novel thing, I guess. I did service in the Swedish military because I'm so old that it was like a mandatory thing, because I was a sniper in the military, so we had to do lots of shooting and shooting different weapons, and also sabotage things, so we had to blow things up. So I sort of had a quite clear view of how violent the whole experience is, and it like really just turns your gut inside out. I see it as it's 50% of the experience. I mean, you see it and you hear it. So it has to be there. I think for me, the ultimate goal is that players completely forget about them playing a game. I just want them to be in a world that they think is there. And I think with sound you can get far, because we can record everything, we can make everything sound real. So it's very powerful. All the things that you put into the game, if you get them to breathe the same air and everything, it can feel like it's actually there. One thing that is very similar to the work we have done for years is that it uses just physics. So this has always been a huge challenge, and we've been recording everything, trying to okay, so now this rock will fall down, and how big is the rock? How small is it? How heavy is it? What does it fall onto? And you have to record all of that. Oh, I drop a rock on wood. I drop it in sand. I drop it here. Then I take a bigger rock. I drop that. Then I take many rocks. I drop those. And this tedious work but you have to do it. It's the groundwork that has to be done. And these robots, it's just physics and limbs. Okay, how do we do this? Okay, we need to measure all the joints and try to figure out what everything is going on inside of these robots. These are mechanical things. So we recorded mechanical things, hovering with drones and going up and down, and we use table fans, and we put stuff in the table fans. So when you start to destroy the drones, and then we just put pens in the in the fans and all sorts of things in the fan, and recorded that. So we're just trying to extract all of this information. It's a challenge for sure.
Allow the things in there to be real. That's why we want to use, gradual destructions on the drones. You would shoot up a thruster, and that disables its ability to fly. Of course it does. It's physics talking back to you, and there's something fun to play with physics. You don't need a health bar to tell you that. You just saw it, and you can listen to that, and you can make those calls, trust in the human ability to decode that, listening and looking, and not relying on a UI to tell you the actual truth of what's going on. I think that's also something we've kept in spirit of pursuing this trust in players that they can decode a world and allow their own sort of affordances of how they think the world operates to inform their decision making. I think that's something we've been really adamant about keeping for the player.
There are certain things that you have to start thinking of working with rather than working against, right? Like when you find that, oh, it's so intuitive and compelling to be able to shoot a thruster off of a drone and see it spin out and fly into a wall, and that's awesome and that feels great. But then we also have to be mindful of the fact that, well, if there are a lot of walls and not a lot of room for the enemy to fly around in, it's probably going to fly into that wall and die, and we have to be okay with that, right?
Yeah, it has been a trick, and we've, again, gone through a lot of iterations. We used to put very bright orange glowy weak points on them to be like, you shoot here, please. But one thing that kind of diminished was we actually have all of the enemies physically fly around using forces, and the thrusters on them are the things actually providing those movement vectors. So what that did was it kind of really diminished the fact that you could shear off a thruster and you'd see its flight start to wobble, or even it would knock itself into an object and explode. And what it turned into was shoot the thing with the health bar and then the whole drone explodes, and we kind of lost a lot of that. And it's also not the most interesting gameplay to just only shoot at weak points.
This is the best game I've worked on for me, because it's a game about listening for things. I put so much work in all the Foley stuff, and now that you actually care about that, because now it's a game about listening and listening for other players. And so all the work we did early, because we built like a complete sandbox sort of audio engine type of thing. So now it shines, because now that's what the game is about. You're moving about, you're listening for things, because you really care about those things now, because everything is dangerous, and so you really want to know, like, is there someone there? Is there someone in the adjacent room? What is that person doing? You can hear them opening a locker and just going through the shelves and picking things up.
Players might choose this weapon because it's great for them in PvP. They're a player who can do really good flick aim and get a headshot cleanly, and that can be good for them in PvP, but maybe it doesn't serve them so well in fighting drones. So how can we bake in some more qualities to these weapons that give them a bit different specific purpose that you might choose to bring that? So for example, if you're a player who loves shotguns, that's great at close range, and it's great at things that are kind of generally unarmored unless you have like a slug round. So what if we then made our heavy caliber weapons penetrate drone armor very effectively? And now you're like, well, I don't actually like this breech loader rifle because it's slow and cumbersome, and if I miss, I'm reloading forever, but it will punch clean through a drone's armor. So that's, a choice I'm being afforded now to offset maybe the weak sides of the weapons I do prefer.
We add things to the weapons. I mean, if they look like something that has electrical moving things, then we add those little aspects to it as well. And all the weapons are built from different layers. We have the mechanics separated, this separated, that separated, the echo separated, all the sort of distances that we've been recording them. We split that up and fade it. What you hear when you fire a gun is a large amount of recordings that from the different angles and distances, and then we sort of put that together into a gun model. So if someone is firing from far away, you hear a far away gunshot of that caliber or whatever. So it's built out of 1,000 small parts. And then you can also stick an electric motor in there, and it will just work with this whole model. It's very consistent, and you can sort of just distill everything, but they all come from the same source. So it becomes much easier to do something that sounds really believable.
Embark had established their new vision for Arc Raiders, a game that attempted to blend PvE with player-on-player combat, a game that attempted to blend the intimate exploration of their detailed levels with the tension of extraction shooters. But it was finding the right blend of all of this that was going to prove their biggest challenge. In resetting Arc Raiders to this extraction game experience, the studio embarked on a difficult plan. These games are notoriously tough to balance, not just ensuring that players of all skill levels have a rewarding experience, but that people who play solo don't get swamped by those who play teams. That risk is rewarded without being overly cruel, that the game can create tension around its goals without stunting player progress. In a single-player game, it's very easy to give players cookies for doing a good job. In most multiplayer games, skill and teamwork are the tools to winning. This is what makes a game like The Finals, a competitive round-based shooter, a good candidate for free-to-play. But in a game where players are going to require satisfying progression, where survival is so important, the team was really struggling to find this right balance between risk and reward. So before we can talk about progression, we need to first talk about the decision to drop free-to-play. This decision massively helped issues the team were having with the progression, because drip-feeding content or artificially holding back progress felt at odds with the game. But putting a price tag on the experience was also going to present some challenges. So where did this decision come from, and how exactly did it change ARC graders?
It's actually in many ways made it drastically easier. In free-to-play, you need to, in some ways, make things a little stickier than they would be otherwise, take a little more time, a little more grind, just so players are more incentivized to, stay in and stick into those loops and keep playing your game, and then ideally are incentivized to then spend money on that game. So for this type of title, it made it kind of hard to respect the player's time in some of these areas around crafting or sessions and things like that, because we were almost had a hand on their forehead going, slow down a little bit, where it felt a little bad. So as soon as that decision came down, it made us able to make things take the amount of time that felt appropriate in a lot of ways. So crafting no longer has timers on it that you have to wait out, or the amounts of things we're asking you to collect are a little more rational, or match the effort and outcome match each other a little more precisely, and things like that. So it's helped a lot, but it does, on the other side, again, launching at a price point, we still need ways to monetize that doesn't feel predatory or things like that. So that's also been an interesting challenge.
It's a pure market. It's like, how do we adapt to what the market wants? A free-to-play game would attract a lot of players, and we can maybe get tens of millions of players for a while. But as we started building what would become the rebirth of ARC graders, we started looking at, it was actually the team started asking questions. Free-to-play, is this the right model for us?
One of the early tenets we set for ourselves is that we wanted to be more approachable than kind of the standard extraction shooter, which can result in just this poverty loop of I have nothing, I go in with my knife, I fail, I try again, and it is very tricky, right? Because anytime the game slaps you for doing PvP in a PvP game, that feels bad, right? So it is tricky, and there's kind of passive ways you can do it and active ways you can do it. And some of the passive ways is just leaning into some of the tenets of extraction games or similar, like you're expending resources, it's risk to you to do this fight because you don't know whether you're gonna win, so you stand to lose. And having that fear of losing your stuff or losing that fight, hopefully, is something that gives a person pause. A more active solution is doing things like world activities, quests, or other types of challenges that don't necessarily require multiple people, but are greatly benefited from having multiple people doing it. So getting people to temporarily form alliances. And that's actually kind of our unicorn in some ways, is getting those tenuous alliances to happen organically. You can obviously party up deliberately and go in with your friends, but that's a very different dynamic than seeing somebody in the wild and feeling out the situation. We have a lot of nonverbal communication efforts that we've put into the game. So through our ping system, our emote system, things like that. So you can kind of convey a lot of meaning with one input.
I like both solo and groups. When I go with groups, I'm very aggressive, maybe way too much. I'm always the first one to die. But when I'm playing solo, I'm actually quite stealthy. I like that nature of the game, that you can actually decide what you want to do, right? So when I'm playing with the team, I try to every session put a different hat. It's like sometimes I'm like, I'm gonna shoot, no questions asked. I will shoot first. And just to create that in the playtest as well, because that's how the game will be played. I think some players will be like, I don't know, they accumulated too much wealth, now they want to spend it, they're gonna go with all the weapons, everything, and they're gonna shoot at sight. And sometimes they'll be poor trying to get their stuff, sometimes they'll just want to do their quests. And I like the fact that our game allows for all of that.
To launch a new game today, irrespective of what platform you're on or what type of game it is, it's harder and harder and harder to break into kind of a critical mass that makes any financial sense. I think game developers out there are really scratching their heads thinking, I made a great game. And often you see today that if you've done a really good job, you'll see players jump on, they'll stay there for a while, but guess what? Then they drop out and go and do something else. A big component of that is due to the fact the game didn't have the attributes or instruments needed to retain the players. So it's on us as game developers, it's not the gamers' fault. We need to do a better job of making sure that they have a need and a desire to stick around playing our game. And what can we learn from our previous games? Having gotten finals into the market, we saw a big peak, like a crazy amount of people, then we saw a drop off. Now, because of hard work, we're seeing people return to the game and we're seeing a growth curve coming back. But I think it's always going to be in what's the long-term motivation for a player to play. It sits in the progression, in the meta layer, making sure that there are meaningful things to do in the game apart from just running around and shooting people. That's probably our biggest challenge and will remain our biggest challenge when we launch the game and after launch.
Primarily, I think our biggest concern right now is what does the end game look like? Because what often happens in these games is they either have a seasonal reset mechanic, so there's just always a clock on what you're doing, and then that tends to culminate in towards the end of that, players bringing all their best, shiniest things and just duking it out until the reset happens. And so there's been a lot of talks about how we actually handle that. What do we lean into for PvE? What types of events can we do? Seasonal storylines, things like that. So getting that shaped up, I think, is kind of what I'm most keen to figure out, because players even internally are like, well, I have amazing gear. My stash is full of amazing gear. I very rarely die. Nothing is asking me to use that. And part of the answer is the giant robots coming back in a form that makes sense for this game. But then what's the framework for highly skilled or highly wealthy players to then go and challenge themselves or be challenged by and earning additional awards? And we're going to have, kind of the traditional things like battle passes and stuff where you can work through those, but what sort of extra motivation can we give to those players who need something to do?
We've covered a bunch of areas of design in this video, but there is one large mechanical elephant in the room: the machines themselves. In the first video in this series, I mentioned how one of the biggest technology investments the studio had made was in the locomotion technology driving the movement of these machines, a brand new way to create believable, intimidating enemies that adapted to having parts of their structures blown off. The struggle to get this technology to work was ongoing throughout the entire development of Arc Raiders, and continues today. So in the next episode in this series, we're going to explore how the arcs themselves were built, the technological struggles the teams have undergone to wrestle satisfying gameplay out of them, and what their groundbreaking technology means for the future of this game, and perhaps many more. See you then.